G'day, welcome to this episode of the ADF Architecture TV series. My name's Chris Muir, I'm your friendly Australian ADF product manager. Thanks for watching this bonus episode, in fact 2 bonus episodes of the ADF Architecture TV series coming up. Why have we got some bonus episodes for you? Well, given the world's just gone through Christmas, and maybe you celebrate it, maybe you don't, but also most of the world's just gone through a new year, we thought we'd give a gift to you and bring some of the topics forward that we've actually got planned for much later in the ADF Architecture TV series and bring them forward so you could enjoy them now. In addition, with the idea of giving, we thought we'd pick a topic that, rather than just talking about the architecture of your ADF applications, would address the needs of your users and a special group of people that we should actually always include in our designs of our application. So what we're going to do in this episode and the next episode is look at, for our ADF applications, designing our applications for accessibility. In this episode, we're going to look at the definition, what is an accessible application, and the need and importance of designing your applications for accessibility. In the next episode, we'll look at, then, from an ADF perspective, what you can do for your applications, the front end, the user interface, to make your applications more accessible. So thanks for joining us on these 2 episodes, these 2 bonus episodes. I hope you enjoyed them. Let's now dig into the definition of accessibility, the need and importance of accessibility in your ADF applications. So a formal definition of accessibility is the extent to which products, systems, services, and environments or facilities can be used by people from a population with the widest range of capabilities to achieve specified goals in a specified context of use. So what does that mean from your ADF development perspective? Well, from your ADF applications perspective, what this really means is that your ADF application is available for use by the people with the widest range of abilities and disabilities, of course. Okay, so really what we're talking about is not just aiming your application at people who are, I guess we'd call abled, but as people that have maybe visual impairments, hearing impairments, cognitive impairments, motor impairments. Okay, making your applications not just usable for the average Joe, but anyone that has one of these other types of impairments. Now, one of the issues about the word accessibility is sometimes people confuse the word accessibility with usability. They think it means just making your application more usable, more user-friendly. That's not correct. Accessibility is making your application specifically usable by people with disabilities. And people with disabilities may have special needs beyond people without disabilities that you may need to cater for. So when you're building your applications, you might need to change the application in some way to make it more usable for people with disabilities. Now, the interesting thing about that is if you do happen to change your application to make it more usable for people with disabilities, often you will get the added benefit thanks to the activities that you've undergone, the design, maybe simplification of the design, maybe rearranging things on your screens. The general population, i.e. people without disabilities, may just find the application more usable anyway. So you get a double benefit in making your applications more accessible by bringing the application, making the application available to people with disabilities, but also potentially making it more usable to the entire general user base. So we've got a bit of a definition of what accessibility is from a computing system perspective now. Now let's talk about the importance of addressing accessibility in your application design. One of the first things to understand is that in terms of the country that you live in, most countries in the world actually have legislation that says that you need to make your applications accessible to people with disabilities. So the United States, the European Union, Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, and so on and so forth, all tend to have legislation that addresses the needs of disabilities and says to you, not only as potentially a government department, but also a commercial organisation, a business as such, that you need to make your systems accessible. Now, let's admit that reading that sort of legislation, reading any sort of legislation, isn't the most exciting things in the world. So let's try and summarize what that legislation says for you so you get a better understanding of what you need to do. So the broad premise of all these regulations or this legislation is that organisations must develop, procure and maintain or make use of enterprise and IT systems that are accessible to all employees and members of public with disabilities. Also, employers must make reasonable accommodations unless it poses an undue hardship. And employers must not place an employee at a substantial disadvantage in comparison with persons who are not disabled. So you can see there's quite strong words here about what you need to do. Now there are some narrow exceptions to these pieces of legislation and regulations. Some have to do with national security, some have to do with for a particular disability there is no solution available, and others may be that, well, to build in disability support into your system would provide or would cause undue burden. But remember, the emphasis is on you, the duty of care is on you to prove that. You can't just say, I didn't think that we really needed to worry about it because we thought we fell into one of those narrow exceptions. You actually need to document and prove that. Okay, now the legislation, well, let's admit, it sounds a bit, foreboding, and I don't really like going around saying statements like, you must, you must, you must. So let's try and wrap that sort of negative terminology. Hey, what we're trying to do here is positive, but that negative terminology, let's flip it on its head to try and give you a positive reason for attempting to accommodate accessibility into your applications. Now, one of the first reasons to do that is it just makes good business sense, whether you're a commercial or a government organisation. Around the world, the statistics do vary slightly, but around the world, generally speaking, about 16% of the population has one or more disabilities. So think of that from a commercial perspective in terms of customers. If you're going to ignore 16% of your customer base, you're basically saying 1 in 10 sales, nearly 2 in 10 sales, you're going to throw away. Now, would you really want to do that? There's maybe up to 20% of your profit margin gone. Otherwise, if you're a government department and you're providing services to the general public, again, you would be saying, no, 1 to 2 in every 10 people that walk in our door, we're not going to provide services to them, even though they're paying taxes and that's exactly what they're paying you to do. They're asking you to provide them services. In my personal family, just to give an anecdote, just to give you an idea of, how many people have disabilities, I have a brother who is in a wheelchair, paraplegic. My father's had numerous operations on his eyes and cannot see very well. And I have my other brothers, in fact a wide range of my brothers, are colourblind. Okay, now I'm fortunate enough not to have any of those issues, but at the same stage, everybody in their lives will have somebody with a disability of some sort. So rather than just thinking about from a computing perspective, there's a bunch of users and people with disabilities are another category of people, just think about that, hey, these are real people, people that you know on a day-to-day basis, and you're really building these systems to not only accommodate the person next to you who is able-bodied, but also the people that have some sort of disability. Returning to the idea of good business sense, and we talked about, well, addressing your customers, or all the general public if you're a government department. Obviously, when you're addressing people with disabilities, you're bringing down the barriers in order for them to make use of your systems. If we widen that definition, though, it gets a little bit more interesting, because if you think about, okay, from a consumer perspective, they may be our customers, but flip that around, they also may be your employees. So you're a commercial organisation or you're a government department, you need to build your systems to cater for people with disabilities within your own labour force. Now, again, if you don't address their needs, what you're effectively saying is, well, normally I'd recruit anybody in the large labour pool out there, but effectively what I'm saying is if I don't write my systems to be accessible, I'm going to potentially say that 15 or 16% of the labour force can't work for me. Now, the labour force is expensive and demand and supply is always an issue, so by actually going, no, we will write our systems to be accessible, suddenly you give yourself another, let's say, 16% of the workforce to work with. Now again, a little personal anecdote here, having worked for a lot of commercial and government organisations over the years, one of the things I've noticed that of organisations that make their systems accessible, that generally speaking they tend to have people who not only of course come and work with them now because they've got disabilities but can still use their systems, but those disabled people, they become some of the best staff members in the organisation because they've found a place where they can actually work on the systems and they become business experts and make your business, your organisation, your government department more effective, more productive. So there's really a good reason to get your systems in line such that, hey, anyone can work on them. So moving along from that, what other reasons to make your systems accessible? Well, we talked about usability. Generally speaking, if you focus on making your systems more accessible, then they will be more usable, and that will be not only usable for people with disabilities, but the rest of the able workforce. So you will find that, well, from a productivity basis, that your users' productivity will increase. And even if you look inside Oracle, where we've been talking about more recently simplifying our UIs, for a lot of that reason is just to make them easier for people with disabilities, and again just addressing that workforce labour need, efficiencies and so on and so forth. Finally, why else should you think about making your systems accessible? Let's be honest, it's just the right thing to do. It is something that you are morally obliged to do. It's something that we should be thinking about on a day-by-day basis. Okay, so we've thought about the business need now and the benefits we might get from it. Now let's try and help you understand the different types of disabilities out there so you have an idea of what you may need to design your systems for. There isn't, so to speak, a one-size-fits-all disability. There are lots of different types, but they can be categorized. And that is, there are people with visual impairments, there are people with motor impairments, people with cognitive impairments, and people with hearing impairments. Let's talk about all of those. First, considering visual impairments. Now, this is really a broad spectrum of users and disabilities. It can include people who are completely blind, or as you may know, blindness, sometimes it has a percentage rating. So some people are 100% blind, some people are 80, some people are 50, and so on and so forth. There are other people who are partial sighted or wear glasses, or things are generally just blurry for them. And then of course you've got people, like I mentioned, my brothers, who are colourblind, and a large proportion of the male population are colourblind, some females but mostly males. Now for blind people, when thinking about their disabilities and building your systems to assist them, what you need to know is a lot of blind people use screen reading tools, or what we might call assistive technology, to read, say, websites or the application to them in order to manipulate the application. Now, I don't have any videos or audio I can share with you, but if you go onto YouTube, you can find a couple of videos of JAWS, one of the more common screen reader type software, and you can actually listen to it reading a website to the blind person. And it's really, from my perspective, it's really a lot of work. It takes a long time for the application to work its way through describing the web pages. And even a simple page like the Google page, whew, it's a bit of work there. So these sort of software, if you're going to think about them, you're going to use them, or you're going to, I should say, allow users to use them to use your sites, then you've really got to think about with your applications how to simplify those sites such that screen reading software is faster, more productive, and works for blind people. Now, people with partial sight, or wear glasses or things along those lines, generally it's a case of making text larger, not putting lots of detail on the screen. For colorblind people, well, it's things along the lines of error messages that are in red. They may not be able to see the color red, so you may need to actually put the word error in front of the error message. I have a personal anecdote for a number of years ago where I was supporting a number of users around Western Australia, and they used to be really good at ringing me up and saying, "Chris, we've hit a bug." And they always used to do a pretty good job, and I had one particular user who was fantastic at ringing up and saying, "This is the problem, how do we solve it, Chris?" And I used to really quite enjoy working with him. But I do remember one time when he rang me up and he was describing a problem on the screen, and I just couldn't understand what he was seeing on the screen because it was different from what I was seeing. And to cut a long story short, because he was colorblind, he couldn't actually see some of the text on the screen at all. So to me, I was going, there's a bit of text there, there's a bit of text over there, why can't you see it? And it was only at the end we realized that he was colorblind. The next category of disabilities is that of hearing impairments, either people who can't hear at all, or have lost hearing in one ear, or partial hearing. Now, admittedly, in computing systems, most computing systems, the needs that you're going to have to deal with are from people with visual impairments because they're looking at your website or your application. So in terms of hearing impairments, it may not be something that we need to address. However, if you have audio coming out of your application, or some sort of alarm or beep or bell or something along those lines, well, you need to think about making that work for somebody who can't hear. You may already have an older, say a grandparent or a parent who has an old style phone at home, but rather than relying on that phone ringing and them hearing it, they actually have a big flashing light on the phone. And you may need to think about something similar within your applications for people that have a hearing impairment. In terms of motor impairments, this is people who, for whatever reason, may not be able to move or may have restrictions on their hands and their arms. And if you think about how we interact with computing systems, we use, even on iPads or iPhones, we use our fingers and hands quite a lot. Traditionally, we touch keyboards and mice or mouses, and iPhones and iPads, we're using our fingers. And for people that can't freely move or can't use their digits or fingers or have no fine motor control, this is going to prove to be a problem. Now, it's interesting when you consider this, though, is that, well, some people, yeah, they can use a keyboard but can't use a mouse because it requires too much accuracy. So you may, for those users, have to build in more keyboard controls. But in building in those more keyboard controls, this is one of those examples where you're building up additional usability for the rest of your users, because you're probably aware of, you as a computer professional, you potentially like using the keyboard to fire off macros over using the mouse. So here we see a benefit that making your application more keyboard friendly might actually benefit a wider user base. In terms of motor impairments, you also have people who have a lot of restrictions, and I guess the most famous example would be Stephen Hawking in his wheelchair, and you know he uses a sip and puff type device I should say, and a limited keyboard to access his computing systems. So I guess for what we might consider to be an extreme disability, if you're going to develop systems for that group of people that have that disability, you're really going to have to think about those devices as a primary part of your design. Finally, another impairment type would be that of a cognitive impairment. And again, there's a wide range of cognitive impairments, from people with dementia, people who have Parkinson's, people who, for whatever reason, maybe have had an accident, gone to hospital and are just confused. Okay, these people may also have problems in using your applications. Now again, you're going to have to think about the use case here, and as it sort of indicates on the screen here, to date there hasn't been a lot of research in making computing systems accessible to the wide category of people with cognitive impairments. But for example, if you're going to be selling an application that's going to be used by hospital patients, okay, like I said before, a lot of hospital patients may be under the influence of drugs, might be currently impaired because they're under shock, under injury, so you may need to think about how your systems will communicate to those people and essentially make it a lot easier for them to use. Now, one of the interesting things about accessibility is you can just accidentally make some simple mistakes that will make your application less accessible. In fact, did you see in that last set of PowerPoints or slides the mistake that I made, which would have made it difficult for a person with a disability to digest the information? If you noticed, on one side of the slide I had the 4 types of impairments: visual, motor, cognitive and hearing. And what I was doing as we were working our way through those impairments, I was highlighting one in black and making the other ones grey. Now imagine you were blind and using a screen reader to read those different slides. Because I hadn't actually hidden completely the greyed out pieces of text, it would have been quite confusing for a blind person via a screen reading piece of software to understand what's going on. So while it was good from an aesthetic point of view, it looked nice, It was good. It appealed to you as a viewer who can see things, not so good for a blind person. Anyway, so in today's ADF Architecture TV episode, this bonus episode on designing your applications for accessibility, we've now talked about, hey, what is accessibility or making your systems accessible, the need, the importance and types of disabilities. In the next bonus episode, what we're going to look at is, well, from an ADF perspective, what you can do in your application to make your application more accessible. Now, we're going to do that in 20 minutes, so it's going to be a rather high-level look about some things you can do, and obviously there's a lot more you can go and research and learn yourself. But the goal here is to give you a flavour about thinking of designing for accessibility to assist people out there with disabilities. So thanks again for joining us on this bonus episode of the ADF Architecture TV series, and we hope you'll join us for that extra bonus episode very, very soon.